I really appreciate being invited to this colloquium. It gives me such pleasure to see colleagues, former colleagues, current colleagues, and former students. I'm especially pleased to see people like Dave Tyak, who is here. Dave and I have taught a course together for 10 years. We co-authored a book and a number of other things. So thank you for coming, Dave. I could go on and take up my 20 minutes by saying something about each person, but I will not do that. But I really appreciate it. Kenji said that he came for the free lunch, but I said, well, I challenged him by saying, well, if you get up and leave before I begin this short talk, then there is indeed a free lunch. But I know Kenji won't do that. Okay. I'm going to answer briefly 3 questions. Where are we now in school reform? How did we get there? And so what? For the first 2 questions, I want to do what lawyers often do when arguing a case. I will stipulate certain statements as facts about the history of school reform. Now, some of these statements may not sound like facts, but as a historian and a practitioner of school reform, I claim that they are. Should anyone quarrel with these statements, I do have supporting references, and we can discuss those in dispute in the Q&A. So I stipulate the following. I'm not going to read it for you. And that historical pattern, what I call fact 1, that historical pattern among reformers is exactly what has occurred over the past 3 decades. Market-inspired school reformers, using low U.S. scores on international tests, time and again have claimed that chronically low-performing public schools have hampered national economic growth, innovation, and productivity. Now, exactly how did that happen? According to the reformers, they point to schools producing graduates mismatched to the job skills that employers needed to compete in a constantly changing global marketplace. To solve this serious problem of low academic performance and inadequately prepared graduates, policy elites, including state and federal officials, have, over time, created and legislated a school reform agenda containing the following items. Now, these are going to be very familiar to you, so I'm going to just go over them as bullets about this current school reform agenda. Common and high K-12 academic standards. State and national tests to determine if all students meet those standards. Student test scores as the primary metric to determine the success of policies. Accountability regulations that hold districts, schools, students, and teachers responsible for results. Expanded parental choice, mainly through publicly financed charter schools. Non-traditional trained teachers and administrators. Teacher and administrator evaluation and compensation on the basis of student test scores. Now, this market-inspired reform agenda that has evolved, it didn't come all at once, has evolved over decades, values efficiency, effectiveness, competitiveness, incentives, and equity. Business and civic leaders across the nation, as well as public polls, endorse this current school reform agenda and its values. Furthermore, since the early 1990s, this agenda has enjoyed bipartisan political support among state and federal officials. The evidence, however, of whether this multifaceted strategy has improved schooling for U.S. students, including minorities and English language learners in urban districts, or that skilled human capital has indeed led to national economic growth and an improved market position, that evidence remains highly contested. Fact 2. Okay, go ahead. Yeah, I got it. Thanks. During the last, it's nice that they have a paper clip for this. That's very nice. I like the low tech. Right? Can you hear me without the mic?
No.
And Larry, we keep pushing these buttons for you here.
Do you know, Kenji, those buttons were installed in this in 1973? I was a graduate student with Paul Chapman, who's here, and we played with those buttons while people were lecturing to us. They didn't work. They didn't work then. All right. Fact number 2. During the last decades of the 19th century and the early years of the 20th century, I'm going on rewind to about over a century ago, a business and civic coalition of educational progressives lobbied the federal government, state school boards, and urban districts to create vocational schools and curricula to prepare youth for jobs in an industrial-based economy. The federal government began subsidizing vocational courses during World War I. Progressive reformers then created the comprehensive high school in the 1920s. Those comprehensive high schools had a multi-tiered, tracked curriculum that included vocational education. That curriculum sorted students by their probable destination upon graduation into blue and white collar jobs and college. At that time, vocational education was crucial to the goal of equal educational opportunity. By the 1970s, however, reformers were dismantling separate vocational schools and the multi-track curriculum. While the comprehensive high school still exists, vocational education courses have migrated to community colleges and other venues. Currently, now we're coming back to the present, currently the 3-decade-long concentration on schools as instruments for national economic growth in the name of equity and global competitiveness has created a college prep curriculum for all students. The promise is that everyone goes to college now. The present market-inspired reform agenda, like the earlier movement in the 20th century for vocational education, has overwhelmed other collective purposes that have driven U.S. schools since the early 19th century, actually. Business and civic leaders, parents and educators wanted schools, then and now, to prepare youth for the economy, but they also expected, and expect now, public schools to prepare children to participate politically and economically and socially in the community, but particularly politically in the community. They want and they expect to expand educational opportunity. They want and expect to reduce inequities in society, and at the same time, help individuals climb the social ladder to success. This last purpose of schools as a vehicle for social mobility has meant that parents see schools as an individually acquired consumer good to help their sons and daughters achieve success in life. The economic purpose for tax-supported schooling, a public good, has dominated policy debates for well over a century, and in the past 3 decades has joined social mobility, a private good, to suck all the oxygen out of any discussion of civic and other purposes in education. Policy talk refers to the cyclical rhetoric of past and present reformers' gloomy assessments of schooling and their overconfident solutions to recurring problems. Remember fact one. Hyper-excited policy talk occurred over national defense during the Cold War with the Soviet Union. And we hear echoes of it with the fears of Chinese economic and military hegemony in Asia. So too have Americans in the 1890s and the 1960s heard dire predictions and fiery rhetoric about threats to U.S. market competitiveness from graduates unprepared for jobs, and of course global competition. Ditto now for policy talk about distance learning or online instruction transforming U.S. schools and colleges. It occurred in the 1960s when it was called distance learning. It reoccurred in the 1990s, and it's now. Pronouncements from federal officials. Take a look at the 2010-2011 National Technology Plan. And for-profit companies as well as recent books such as Liberating Learning and Saving Schools. They all promise a brave new high-tech world of individually tailored online learning at home and elsewhere, eventually replacing, as some promise, brick-and-mortar schools. In short, policy talk is hyperventilating rhetoric that we have heard repeatedly. Policy action refers to the decisions that governors, mayors, superintendents, and legislators make in adopting policies to solve social problems. Examples range from school boards buying iPads for kindergartners, superintendents establishing a new math curriculum. It also extends to the U.S. Congress and President approving No Child Left Behind. Cycles of policy talk and policy action about children failing to read, their lack of critical thinking, high school dropouts, low academic standards, you name the crisis, have occurred many times in the past. Policy implementation in schools and classrooms, however, it is not cyclical. It is linear. There are trends. Schools as institutions have structures, cultures, and history. What David Tyack and I call the grammar of schooling, or what Seymour Saracen called the regularities of school organization and culture. These regularities change slowly and incrementally so that trend lines become noticeable only over time. And when trend lines become visible, they bear the fingerprints of teachers. Designing, adopting, and implementing new programs stretch out over 5 or more years. When researchers observe classrooms to see how computers are used by teachers in activities, or what math and reading lessons teachers put into practice, they find great variation among classrooms in the same school and among schools in the same district. Some teachers pick and choose elements of a new policy and its program. Other teachers just ponder when to begin. And then there are others who have changed the policy by redesigning activities and lessons. And of course, there are teachers who ignore the new policy. Because of school culture and organizational realities, change is gradual and episodic, even erratic. But trends do appear over time. What happens in schools and classrooms then is a world apart from the hyperbole and gloom accompanying cyclical policy talk and action. Now, these three statements about historical patterns in school reform, I stipulate as facts to answer the question of where we are now in school reform and how we got here. Now I move to the so what question. Of what use is it to map out the current school reform agenda, how that agenda emerged over time, conflicting purposes of public schools, and distinctions between policy talk, action, and practice? Here are a few reasons that I believe we should take note of these facts, these past patterns in school reform that I've identified, and others, of course, not only me here. First reason, historically it is clear to me that failing to distinguish between policy talk, action, and implementation has confused the public and turned many educators and parents into cynics about school reform. That has occurred because repeated gloomy predictions of failing schools again and again and again imply that teachers don't teach and students don't learn. Implications that have little connection to what actually occurs in classrooms. That fusion of words with policy action without reference to what teachers actually do is a mistake that reformers have made repeatedly but could avoid. They can sort out grim policy rhetoric and adopted solutions that overpromise from the long chain of events that occur before schools and teachers actually put into practice some version of these policies. They can educate the public, legislators, and school staffs that written and spoken words vary greatly from the realities that exist in schools and classrooms. A second reason for the so what question. Few reformers in the larger public understand clearly the multiple and conflicting purposes that schools have served in a democracy. Especially in the past century, when economic rationales for schooling have driven policy debates, informed the making of the policy, and even influenced practice. The tensions between individual and collective purposes for schooling, between the public good of preparing citizens and the private good of seeking individual advantages from educational credentials, need to be debated openly and connected to current school reform agendas. My third reason, historically, even though those purposes are embedded, the purposes I just spoke to, are embedded in the current school reform agendas, policymakers, including legislators, mayors, and superintendents, have seldom disclosed to the public or those who are charged to implement decisions the specific goals, assumptions, logic, and evidence of policies that they champion. Consequential policies like No Child Left Behind, one-to-one computing, more charter schools, or pay-for-performance plans might have benefited from the sunshine of disclosures. Such public discussions of expectations, reasoning, and available evidence to both staff and public might well make possible less flawed and more informed policies that have consequences for children, educators, and the larger society. I'm going to end my list of reasons with a quote from historian Bernard Balin, who offers even another answer to the so what question. And I'm quoting him now. History is the necessary, unique way of orienting the present moment so that you know where you are and where we have come from, and so you don't fantasize about the past and make up myths to justify some immediate purpose. So you make decisions based to some extent on what has gone before, on the knowledge of actual experience. Accurate historical knowledge is essential for social sanity, end quote. Thank you. I welcome your questions.
So I've got a mic here, so I think we can hear you, John, but down here we probably want to get the mic. Go ahead.
Larry, thanks so much for a stimulating lunchtime talk. I hope Kenji had enough to eat. Certainly I did. Enough to think about and chew on. I want to take up the social mobility as a private good idea.
Sure.
Being new to the country, I kind of thought that that was part of the public good, part of the promise of education was social mobility, and the focus on social mobility from No Child Left Behind to any of the other initiatives seems to me to be focused on this as, to me, an impossible public good, but a public good in the sense that if we had social mobility, then we would have equity, we would have democracy, we would have all of those ideals realized.
Well, I think David Lavery and Michael Katz have written about this better than I have. The way I would put it is that social mobility has been interpreted as getting a private advantage at the expense of other people in order for you to advance. Because all that the public schools do is start you off in getting access to a tax-supported education. You start off in the same line. But after that, you are on your own. And it's that individual kind of self-regulation, the motivation, the drive, the determination that is so individualized. Oh,
Your
that-
friend is back.
Yeah, that is so individualized that that Lavery and others and I would agree that it's more of a private than a public good.
Even though it's promised as a public, I mean, I think it's presented as a public good, and maybe treating it as privatized creates a false distinction.
How is it presented as a public good? Just because you go to school, you can, not everyone goes to college, even though the promise is there now.
That's what I mean, it's the promise that I'm talking about.
Oh, the promise, you mean the policy talk, the rhetoric.
Yes.
Oh, yes, okay, well, but there, that's part of it, sure, but there are ideals out there. But how you achieve it, how you get it, is all by private effort, and every family wants their kids to achieve, even if it means that they will get something that kids down the street will not get.
But then doesn't the blame fall on the student and not the system? Sorry, I'll
Yeah,
finish there.
well, I think that's accurate, but that's true of most institutions in this country, is that the focus is on the individual. So if you fail at whatever institution it is, you're to blame. I think that's part of the culture that we're embedded in. And that ain't that different from Canada. Come on, John.
Fair enough.
Yes.
And just to follow up on that, I mean, I think one of the things that's interesting about K-12 education policy talk versus post-secondary policy talk at this moment in US history is that I think it now is increasingly assumed that it's the school's fault if children fail. Right? It's the schools that are failing children. When we have this belief, you know, that every child can learn under the appropriate circumstances. It's in college now where the presumption is still that students fail rather than schools. So I was just wondering if you could talk about that a little more. I mean, my read of policy talk in K-12 is it really is the school's fault and the teacher's fault and the union's fault, not
no,
the kids.
No, we are talking about rhetoric.
Yes.
Okay. So, and rhetoric is important because it gives you the sense of values and what is important in public discussions. Now, the current climate for that no excuses, the Michelle Reed, the Washington D.C., Joel Klein, no excuses, that Teach for America. We don't give excuses, okay? That is a change from the 1970s and 80s in K-12, where the effective schools movement tried to change that rhetoric because of the Coleman Report and the policy rhetoric that came out of the Coleman Report that schools can't do very much. Daniel Moynihan, advising President Nixon, said we should go look at schools with benign neglect because after the Coleman Report, what can you expect? Inequality of educational opportunity. It's the family that really. Well, there has been a sea change in that rhetoric to beginning in the 90s and where we are now, that schools are to blame and teachers. Remember, we have this schizophrenia about teachers. You praise them and you bash them at the same time. So what we have in that rhetoric, that's been a shift. But even in that shift, there is a minority movement that says, hey, look, you got to look at where kids come from. I mean, the bolder, broader approach to equality, a group of not policymakers, mostly academics, Richard Rothstein and others have pointed out that you can't neglect decades of research that has shown that high percentages of a percentage of achievement, academic achievement, can be attributed safely to the family. You can't ignore that. So that discussion still is going on now, even amid the notion that schools are to blame if kids don't achieve. Now at higher ed, that was a way, the individual kind of, you're on your own bottom. I would agree with you, Ms. Ross. Yeah, I would agree with that. But there had been that change in rhetoric, and it's still being challenged.
Yeah, two comments again as a kind of outsider from Europe this time. And I would just like your reaction to it. Okay, the first one is one of the things I do find strange here is the lack of vocational education in the States, whereas in Europe there's much more of it. I find it strange, I think, in a context where it's clear that what you've got in the jobs market, okay, is a kind of increasing bifurcation between those jobs which require highly educated people in order to perform them, and a growing sort of mass of what you might call service jobs which don't require, questionably, okay, that level of education. So that disparity in a kind of policy terms seems odd and perverse to me, particularly since that academic education, okay, which is, I think, offered to a large number of students, really doesn't suit them and doesn't motivate them in that case. That's one of my kind of comments. The other comment is, it seems to me that I welcome your thoughts on this one, that in the current context, if you take the kind of Giddens argument that we live in a society of late modernity where there's been a kind of sort of weakening of traditional structures in society, in that sense, the family, the church, other kinds of things. The only thing politicians really have to manipulate as a tool to make themselves accountable to the public is education in some senses. And they look increasingly to this to manipulate this. And I see this not just in the States, but I see this in Europe, that politicians pay increasing attention to education in a way that they didn't 30 or 40 years ago.
Now, you made two comments. Did you want to?
Yeah, I just like your reactions to those thoughts. Really.
Yeah, the vocational education, as I tried to point out, was part of a major coalition at the end of the 19th, early 20th century, and was successful. There's no question about it. For at least a half century or more in public schools. But vocational education got a bad rap in many ways in its implementation because it became, particularly in urban districts, it became the last resort. It reinforced the false distinction between hand-minded, how does it, what's that, the dichotomy, hand-minded?
Hands-on, minds-on.
Pardon me?
Hands-on, minds-on? Yeah.
Somebody, you get the picture, I think you know what I'm trying to get at. So by the 60s and 70s, vocational education was gone. What has happened now with College for Everyone, it's remobilized a conversation. Mike Rose has written a very nice piece, and a few other people have pointed out everyone can't go to college. First of all, college is getting out of sight financially. Secondly, who wants to sit another 4 years, listening? Which I have great sympathy for. But it's getting remobilized into a conversation, at least, about that. I don't think it's going to go very far in this country. Now, the second comment was about...
it's about the kind of the increasing focus on education by politically.
I think what Dave Tyack and I did in Tinkering, what David Lavery has done with Someone Must Fail, and Michael Katz, and a bunch of other historians of education and other academics have pointed out that schools in the U.S. Have historically been responsive, have historically been part of that cliche. The nation has a cold, the school sneeze. The idea that that schools are politically vulnerable to anything going on in terms of problems, and then the problem somehow gets a school-based solution to it. Now, what's good about that, from the point of view of policy elites, is that it doesn't do anything about the structures, the processes, what goes on in the larger society, the social, economic, and political structures. Now, whether Europe is learning from that or not, I don't know. And I'm not familiar with how education has gained ascendancy as a place where you can have, where you can get things done. Because in education, it's been a deferral in many ways around national problems. Okay. Mike.
Larry, would you comment, please, about the increasing federal role compared with the states? The country is exceptional in the fact that constitutionally, this responsibility for education resides at the state level. And in fact, that was further transmitted to local level in many states, as you know. So one of the more dramatic things we've seen since the 1917 legislation in VOTEC is an increasing influence, money from the federal level. What are some of the implications there with respect to some of the broad patterns, the other broad patterns that you're talking about?
Well, the implication is that there has been further centralization at the state and federal levels. No child left behind. I mean, you don't beat that in terms of the centralization of federal authority. I mean, no child left behind with the AYP benchmarks that have to be met, schools that are failing. All of that is an enormous growth of federal power and authority for literally a dime out of every dollar, because that's all the feds give to the states and local jurisdictions.
And the dime turns out to be extremely important in today's budget at the local level.
Right.
So are we losing our ability to innovate locally? Is that being tamped down in our pursuit for a national vision?
Well, look, you got the Common Core standards that'll probably materialize shortly. You're going to have, you have a number of groups that are going to develop assessments for those Common Core standards. So we're moving toward that. Now, there is a strong counter movement. You remember, we still have 15,000 school districts. We still have great variety among the states. California being one of the stronger states, Florida being another, and a few other states, but there's great variation among states in terms of how much they press upon their districts. So it's not clear to me that the increase in federal authority stifles innovation. I'm not, for me, that I would only be speculating. I'm not willing to make that, that kind of leap. But that there has been further centralization, no doubt about it. Mike Kirst will tell you in spades how that happens over and over again. Hey, let me call on a graduate student first, and then I'll get Mike and Deborah and Pam. Go ahead, Eric.
Hey, I wanted to ask about this notion of separation between policy talk and policy action and the gloom and doom predictions in terms of the failure of school with respect to the current fiscal crisis that many schools are facing. And is there really a separation between sort of these gloom and doom predictions and as well as the policy talk and policy action? I'm thinking of Wisconsin, for example, where teacher unions have lost a lot of their bargaining power. What seems to be a lot of the talk has turned into some real action. And might we be facing a really sort of gloomy fiscal crisis facing education?
That's a good example, Eric, where policy talk, the anti-union rhetoric, which has been great over the past, well, over the past 30 years. You look at from beginning with Nation at Risk in '83, it was President Reagan 2 years before that broke the strike of the air traffic controllers. So that has been a staple within the GOP policy agenda about unions, and certainly the South with right to work and all that. So the anti-union has been kind of all along, but what had happened with the budget cuts and the recession of 2008 is that the policy talk and action do come together. Now, whether that has It's spread to a few more states. Whether that'll continue to spread, I just don't know. But that would be a good example. Now, whether that affects what teachers do in Wisconsin, Indiana, and Ohio, or Florida, what that affects in classrooms, we don't know yet. We don't know. That's why I want to keep the black box of the classroom right before our eyes all the time, because the policy talk often is distinguished from the policy actions. Sometimes they come together, and they are cyclical. But what happens in the classroom, don't know yet. Okay, Mike.
Yeah, that's exactly where I want to go. I mean, you and I have been around a long time, and as we used to think that it was very hard to do anything behind the classroom door if you were a policymaker.
Yeah.
They closed the door. In the 1980s, it was a gloom and doom legislation. So what I'd like you to talk about is how and why, not whether you think it's good or bad, how or why the various policy changes of the past, let's say, 20 years have changed classroom instruction. I mean, when you go into California, this is testing week for STAR tests, and when you go into California classrooms and you see those standards, how much is driven to those standards? I mean, 30 years ago, we wouldn't have dreamed we had the instruments to get behind the classroom door and influence them as much as we have, we meaning the policy society. So how did that, why do you think that's happened, and do you think it's a really profound impact in the classroom? I prefer for this answer not to discuss whether it's good or bad, you know, the
I heard you.
Just the is. Okay.
I get it.
Just the is, all right.
All right. For me, it would be, my response is that no child left behind. Remember in Texas, it was a Texas miracle, as it was called under George W. Bush, and he basically nationalizes the Texas law to the entire country. So I think with AYP, the identification of schools that need improvement, and the 5 years that it takes before you have to close or restructure or whatever, I think that infrastructure, that legal infrastructure, has had an enormous impact on teachers. But let me make a few distinctions without saying it's good or bad. Number one, it's mostly in low-income minority schools and rural schools, low-income and minority. Yes, it has penetrated suburban schools that have certain percentages of minorities, and the gaps were shown. The idea of disaggregating scores by minority group was, I think, I was going to say it was a good idea, but we'll delete that. Yes, it has affected classroom teaching, mostly, as I would say, in urban districts, not in affluent or what I would call Tier 1 lighthouse kinds of schools, the New Triers, the La Joyas, and so on like that. But it has, and that's a substantial number. Now, how has it affected it? If you look at teacher-centered and student-centered instruction and the tensions between that over the past century that I and many other people have written about, you see that the change has occurred is what I would call the solidification of the intensification of teacher-centered instruction. That's what test prep is. That this is what's going to be important. We put it up on the board, and this is what we're going to work on in the weeks before the weekly testing. So there's been an intensification of teacher-centered instruction. Whether that's good or bad, others, I'm not going to say anything about that right now, but that's what I think has occurred. So those who argued about loose coupling of schools, the institutional theory that John Meyer and many others have focused on, Chiqui Ramirez and others that have focused on, that loose coupling I still think exists in many places where the reach of No Child Left Behind has not gotten into those classrooms. However, there is more of a tight coupling now, and you hear the pushback from parents around testing, teachers, of course, and many other people. But it's not clear how that's going to go because you have bipartisan support on the Republican and the Democrats for No Child Left Behind, other than fixing it up a little. Does that respond to your
Yes,
question,
it does.
Mike? Deborah?
Well, I was actually going to make the same point and press you a little bit on what I thought you had said, that the federal current investment in education has not had a major impact, because I have seen a profound impact, and not just in the teacher-centered instruction, but also what is learned, and I would say, to go even further, what the purpose of schooling is, so that anything that is not tested is no longer part of the sort of conscious purpose of schooling. So I was just surprised when you said, you seem to minimize the effect of the federal centralization, and it seems to me like it is profoundly different from what we have experienced.
Well, federal authority has increased, no question about it, okay? And state authority over schools has increased a great deal. Mike's question, and No Child Left Behind, indicates the reach of federal authority into a certain segment of classrooms, okay? Now, whether that will recede or not, I would doubt in the immediate future, because a lot of it is linked to testing. And the federal government already has given large grants to 2 groups, or perhaps 3 groups, to come up with assessments for the Common Core standard. What we don't know is how the cutoff points are going to be established and so on. To the degree that there is going to be a tight coupling between the standards, the assessments, and the penalties and rewards associated with the future version of No Child Left Behind, then we can talk about its reach into the classroom. The point I want to make is to differentiate and make clear that there's great variation in the 100,000 schools that are across the country, and which there are a number of places that pretty much continue the loose coupling that they had even before No Child Left Behind. That's all I would want. And who is next in the queue? Oh, Pam.
So we've talked about federal influence, state and local influence, but I'm interested in hearing your historical perspective on the role of a few extremely wealthy individuals and foundations in driving the direction of school reform. Is there historical precedent for this? How do you see this affecting the nature of school reform in this country?
There are historical precedents. There's precedents historically for everything. If I can't find them, Dave will. I'm trying to think of the Carnegie Corporation at the turn of the century was heavily invested in public schools. The Rosenwald Foundation in southern schools. So philanthropy has played a role all the way through. In fact, the 8-year study received some funding from 1 or 2 of the foundations. All of this is to say that what is going on now is a little different, because what I call policy elites refers to federal, state officials, academics whose particular intellectual agendas converge with with others in federal and state positions, and the philanthropist. There is now I will call it an uncommon convergence of a set of school reforms that ought to be installed. You know, the Gates, the Broad, the Walton foundations. Diane Ravitch has a chapter, the Billionaires Boys Club has a chapter on that. She writes acerbically and scathingly about that. What I would say is that it does raise a number of questions in my mind about public decision-making, and I hear murmurs of people concerned about that, but it's not risen to the level of people getting concerned enough to have public debates about that yet. But it's of concern to me. And that's the best that I could tell you in terms of responding to that. Yes, ma'am. Did I get the cue over there? Okay, yes, ma'am.
I have a question. Am I reading history wrong when I think that so much of reform effort, No Child Left Behind, the special ed law, the dropout prevention and so on, is designed to close the gap from the bottom to the middle, and there is no program or money or effort from the middle to the top, and is that the way we've always run our schools, or am I misreading what's going on?
Well, yeah, there's no right and wrong in history, it's interpretation. I think the way you described it, I would say that it's an equity-driven agenda that's trying to raise the bottom to the middle, the bottom quartile to the middle quartile. I think that is accurate. And it is supported, has been supported by both Republicans and Democrats for different reasons, mind you. One might be social justice, the other might be concerned about the economy. But I would say that's accurate. Kenji, you were going to...
Yeah, actually, though, I will defer, if there are other sort of older people, less older people who would like to ask questions. Although I don't know the age of the people who are asking questions. If there are any graduate students.
Why don't you ask the question?
Before I really dig myself in.
Here, have a microphone.
Oh,
That's your question. That's
No,
all.
I was going to ask about, Patricia Gondara just gave a talk last week, talking about there being an argument raised in Arizona in a court case, Flores, in which the state tried to claim that federal civil rights laws, including EEOA, are superfluous because now there's no child left behind. So they're basically trying to substitute civil rights laws with the more of the incentive, to the extent that you consider NCO being incentive or carrot part. And you haven't said that much about the civil rights and,
Right.
and the stakes part of the policy arena. But there's clearly, there's also rhetoric around that, and there's, sort of implementation and practice around that. And I wonder, from your historical vantage point, what sort of trends you see there?
Well, two quotes came to mind. One was from Rodney Page, when he was U.S. Secretary of Education. And he said, "No child left behind," as it was moving through Congress. Remember, it was the first thing that Bush presented to Congress. As it was moving through Congress, said, "This is civil rights legislation." So already the rhetoric around it was civil rights legislation. I know very little about Arizona, so I'm gonna be pretty mute on, I will be mute on Arizona. The second quote is from the President Obama. He and Arnie Duncan said that education is a new civil right. So I think I would speculate that what Pat was saying had to do with how the state is trying to use No Child Left Behind as a way of avoiding other kinds of sanctions that might be associated with actual legislation going back to the 1964 Civil Rights Law. That's the best that I could tell you. But the rhetoric of civil rights and No Child Left Behind and equity-driven things like charter schools, even pay-for-performance plans, have this kind of aura that these are for the equity of kids who have been poorly served by public schools. And if you are opposed to these things, then somehow you are opposed to civil rights. And it's a debater's move in many ways, so that if you say, for the sake of example, that I don't think everyone ought to go to college, then a whole set of charges come to you that you are opposed to civil rights, you're opposed to equity, and on and on and on. And it becomes a cul-de-sac, a rhetorical cul-de-sac. It's very hard to get out of, particularly if the emotion level rises. Dave?
I wonder if we don't need some more artful repetition. Dennis Phillips one time wrote an article that began I wrote the same article 10 years ago, but nobody was listening, so I'm gonna do it again. I think in this room, there are plenty of people who think there are some good schools around worth preserving, conserving. Why is it we don't have a movement of conservation the way we do with wetlands in the bay?
Thank you, Dave. Let's see, John?
I'm concerned about the amount of attention to individual differences in the school population. And you talked about some people wanting to get the lowest quartile up to the middle quartile. And what I'm concerned about is people that say things like, you know, we discovered in our school district that 50% of the third graders can't even read at the third grade level. As if that's really a terrible thing. But see, people don't even know what the third grade level means. The third grade level is what the average third grader can read. And so 50% are always below the third grade level. And 50% are always above it, no matter what you do. See, and so there's something wrong with our measuring system and the way we talk about it and the public knowledge about what it means. That's part of the confusion that we have to face.
I certainly would agree with you. I think the reporting by journalists has gotten much better on simple statistics. So I think there's a little improvement, at least over the past decade that I've seen that. But basically the understanding of averages, and that's why Garrison Keillor's Lake Wobegon effect gets so much attention, because it is a joke, it's a cliche and everything like that, but you know, if people laugh at it, you know that they understand. But if they don't laugh at it, then there's a problem. Mike, you want to?
Just a footnote to your comment about civil rights as justification for this. I assume part of the reason for that is the 10th Amendment. That is, there has to be a stated federal purpose for the national government to get involved in education. So it's national defense, it's civil rights. I assume that's the one reason.
Go ahead.
And in view of the interest, the new interest in the 10th Amendment on the part of the right, incidentally, I notice at this lecture, we're all sitting on the left.
It's my right.
No, I've nothing.
No,
there is interest by the governors
Right.
traditionally in protecting states' rights.
That's right. Yeah.
And this has taught those who wish to operate at the federal level to better to try at least justify it. I see less of that in education at the moment, but I wonder, you know, unfunded mandates that governors talk about, for example, whether the right will help to elevate the level of the conversation.
Well, there's always been a constituency in the GOP, in the Republican conservative spectrum, about states' rights and decentralization and local control. And that's part of the pushback against No Child Left Behind. And I don't see that right now from my perch. I do not see that lessening at all. It'll be there. It's part of the history and the culture in this country. How are we doing on time?
We have time for one or two more comments or questions.
Right. So speaking of that local control versus federal control, a lot of districts have recently, in fact, in the special election that just ended, they said on the news this morning, like 7 or 8 different locally funded education initiatives have passed. Is there historical precedence for that increased local funding maybe swaying the conversation back towards a more localized conversation around what education is? Or is it more of they're just giving us money to help us achieve the federal goals?
You're talking about here in California?
Here in California.
Well, Mike can probably speak more directly to that, but a number of them failed because they didn't have the 2/3. Is that correct, Mike? And a few did pass. And there has been a movement in California to lower the threshold from 67% to 55%. So I don't think that that's part of that debate. I think we're talking at a time of a severe money crunch. Where is the money going to come from? Because the cuts have been coming here in California year after year and will continue until the economy it grows back healthy.
I was just wondering if you think that might sway it back towards more of a local focus, locally driven.
In Prop 13,
Okay.
that changed, that structurally changed funding in this state. Yeah. Yes, Deborah.
Larry, I would like to ask you a personal question.
Should we leave?
I'm actually asking it for the students, but also for the faculty. Students often, or several students have told me that their advisors have advised them to not write for public audiences because they will be seen as less of a scholar or it will distract them from scholarship. And you are one of a very few of the most revered scholars in the country. The other two happen to be here, Elliot and David, coincidentally or not. And in fact, the other two also write for public audience as you do, as well as for scholarly audiences. So I'd like to ask you what advice you would give students with regard to their engagement and who they see as their audience.
Well, that is a personal question in the sense that, not so much personal for me, but a personal decision on the part of particular people. Graduate student, third, fourth year graduate student, looking to get out of here the fourth or fifth year, you know, and torn by, if that graduate student, he or she is gifted with clear prose, and solid analytic thinking, and the gift of Christmas in their how much they write, then that is a real tension that they have. But their first job is to get out of school and get on with their career.
Thinking long-term career trajectories.
Well, that is a matter of the values you have. Remember, Deborah, I came here as an adult. I had 25 years in public school work, so I had another life before I became an academic. So for me, having a public audience was always part of the mix. Even the academic articles I wrote and the pieces that the books, I would have pieces of those either as op-ed columns or written for a more general audience or a practitioner audience, because for me, that was just extremely important. Now, there are a couple of graduate students that still do that, and young faculty that do that. For Dave and I know Jack Schneider, who was a recent graduate. Jonathan Zimmerman, who is a tenured professor at Penn. No,
NYU.
At NYU. They write these pieces for general audiences. I happen to believe, it's a matter of value, that it's extremely important to have a lot of people out there for the reasons that John was saying about the 50%, is that these issues, look, education is a value-driven institution, and a very important one. And everyone has an opinion. Everyone's gone through the school. Everyone has an opinion on it. And in a democracy, you try to influence opinions all the time. The policy rhetoric, the gloomy predictions and all that, that is part of the democratic set of structures and processes, is that you try to get people's attention. Writing for general audiences, I think, is extremely important. But that's a personal kind of value on my part. Thanks for asking the question. And thank all of you.
Thank you very much.